Alright, good morning guys, and welcome back to this second video of Unit 5, and we're still talking about biogeochemical cycling. Before we get into specific cycles, let's have a look at the general idea, the general plan for this type of cycling in the ecosystem. The three major things that we're going to look at are the green plants, the decomposers that we talked about in the last video, and air and water. So these are the vehicles where we're going to transport nutrients between the biotic world, the living part, and the abiotic world, the non-living part. So if we look at our plan over here, first step is usually the sun, and the sun is going to provide all of the energy for the planet, and we get a supply of energy from the sun every day. That energy is going to be transferred from the sun in terms of light energy into plants. Those are our first trophic level, so it's our first feeding group if we think about a food chain, and they're going to produce food. They're going to take the energy from the sun, which is light and heat energy, and they're going to turn it into chemical energy by photosynthesis. Now that's going to produce a lot of biomass, and that biomass is then going to be available for the next link in our food chain. So this is going to be, if we think back, this is going to be the little rabbit that comes along and eats the carrots, the vegetables. Now that energy is going to be transferred from this trophic group to this trophic group, so on and so on. So once all of these consumers, they die off, so if we go down to this area here, this is going to be the big cat that comes in and eats the rabbit. It's our third trophic level. These are all going to, all of these animals and all of these plants in this food web are going to die off, and that's going to feed the decomposers, and those are the important ones in terms of our understanding in this unit, because those are going to be where our fungi and our bacteria come in, and they're going to be our focus on, because we're looking at microorganisms. Now these decomposers are going to take all the nutrients that all of these consumers used up, and they're going to supply those back into the soil, the air, the water, and they're going to make all of those complicated molecules back into simpler things. And then those simpler things are going to go back, and they're going to be able to feed, not the sun, sorry, that's the wrong place to draw that line. Let me undo that one. They're going to take all of these nutrients and they're going to send it back to our plants, which can use it. So you can see it goes around in a big circle, and that circle is why we call it cycling. And this happens in the environment time in, time out, day after day after day. Now let's have a look at a couple of cycles. Now the first ones we'll look at will be relatively simple in terms of microorganism involvement, but we're going to look at some ones towards the end where it gets quite involved when we're talking about microorganisms. Now let's have a quick look at the water cycle. We're not going to spend too much time on this because it's not terribly important when we're talking about microorganisms on a big scale. But if you look at the arrows in this picture, we're generally seeing a circle, and what happens is we get moisture in the air. And if you look outside today, you can probably see big pockets of that, as we'll call them clouds. And then as moisture builds up in the air, the clouds get really, really heavy, and they get a lot more water in them, and eventually it gets so heavy that the clouds can't hold the water anymore, and that water will fall back to Earth in the form of precipitation. Now that can be whatever falls from the sky. It can be rain. If you're like my folks back in Canada, it will be snow, lots of snow, but all that precipitation will return back to land. And then as it falls on the land, the water will flow over the land, and it'll collect into rivers and lakes, and then eventually they'll collect back into oceans. And the whole time this is happening, the Earth, of course, is going to warm up, and when it gets to a certain temperature, water will start to evaporate, and it'll head back into the atmosphere again. And then that evaporation eventually turns into clouds again, and as the clouds build up, the precipitation, the amount of moisture, the humidity in the air increases, and then we end up with precipitation again. So that's the general idea of the water cycle. Like I said, it's not terribly important microbial-wise, but it's important to know. Now, any organism requires water. So the reason why the water cycle is important is because we depend on it absolutely heavily. Now, bacteria are kind of a special case because they have the ability to survive when there's hardly any water left at all. So when we're in a condition that we call drought. And if you remember from earlier chapters, what will happen is these bacteria, when it's in times of stress and there's low water, they'll develop, they'll take their vegetative cell that we're seeing right here, and within that cell they'll develop an endospore. Now here's a bigger look at the endospore right here. And inside that spore, we've got everything that we would need to make a new bacteria. So this is what happens when we have very low water conditions. So the bacteria is in a situation where there's no water left anymore. It'll form these endospores, and these spores can last for a long, long time. Now, when the conditions get favorable again and there's water present, those spores will germinate and will end up with another cell, and of course those cells will be able to multiply and carry on the population of that species of bacteria. So the water cycle is important, well, it's important to every organism on the planet, but bacteria have found a way to survive when there is very little water around. The next cycle is the oxygen cycle, and a common question is, of course, where can we find oxygen? Well, we can find it in three major places on the planet. We can find it in the atmosphere, which is the collection of gases that surround the planet. We can find it in the biosphere, and the biosphere means anything that's living on our planet. So plants, or animals, or bacteria, fungi, protists, all of those things make up the biosphere. And then finally we can find it in the hydrosphere, and the hydrosphere is the collective amount of water that's on the planet. Rivers, lakes, ponds, oceans, anything that has water we consider the hydrosphere. So we can find oxygen in all of those three domains. And the oxygen cycle basically relies on photosynthesis and then also respiration. So photosynthesis, of course, all the green plants, that's going to be the catalyst that's going to release oxygen into the atmosphere. So we get photosynthesis, and then we get oxygen released from that reaction into the atmosphere. Now, oxygen is used by every animal, plant, bacteria, fungi, protist. It's used by most organisms on this planet, and it even gets used in fires. For example, large forest fires use a lot of oxygen. Decomposition, breaking down organic matter, that takes a lot of oxygen, and even rusting metals, oxidation, that will also require a fair bit of oxygen. So the oxygen cycles between the plants that create the oxygen and then the rest of the organisms on the planet who need that for their metabolism. Another cycle we can talk about is the carbon cycle, and we will find, since we're a carbon-based planet and we're carbon-based organisms, we find carbon absolutely everywhere. We find it in the biosphere, like we talked about in the last slide. We find it in the hydrosphere, the oceans and the waters, the atmosphere, the gases that surround the planet, and we also find it in our geosphere. Now, our geosphere is going to be all of the soil, fossil fuels, the rocks, basically anything underfoot would be what we consider a geosphere. It's also called the pedosphere because we end up walking on it, or the lithosphere because it's made up of many forms of different types of rock. But we can find carbon basically everywhere. Now, all microorganisms require a carbon source. All organisms will require a carbon source. And many of our microorganisms, the important role they play in the carbon cycle is through decomposition. So they will return carbon back to the environment through the process of decomposition. And if we look at the picture there on the right, we can see that it's a fairly complicated cycle when we're talking about the carbon cycle. Two of the things that were really, well, more than two, I guess, but a couple of things that are very, very important in this cycle is photosynthesis by green plants and algae, respiration by all of the organisms that are that are undergoing their daily metabolism, and then what's going to be kind of important for us in this particular in this particular course is this part right here, the microbial decomposition. So I'm not going to go terribly into the carbon cycle. I think you guys have a good hand on it if you think about how we're changing the carbon cycle with respects of adding extra carbon dioxide in our environment, and that's changing the amount of carbon in the atmosphere, which is having a change on our global climate. So I think you guys should have a good grasp of that. So we'll just focus on the microbial role in this particular cycle. Now, carbon will enter the biotic world, so it'll enter the living world, or it'll enter our food chains through photosynthesis. Okay, so that chemical reaction, you can see the equation for it down on the bottom of the slide down here. Our carbon dioxide right here is going to be our carbon, and plants are going to use the energy from the sun plus a bunch of enzymes, and they're going to convert that carbon into glucose, C6H12O6. So here's our glucose molecule right here. And now we've taken carbon dioxide that was in the atmosphere, and now we've turned it into a chemical that's inside of a plant. So up here in our picture up here is the same thing. We've got our sun. The carbon dioxide comes from the atmosphere. It gets into the plant. It goes through a bunch of enzymatic controlled reactions. We release oxygen, which goes into the oxygen cycle, and glucose is kept inside the plant so that it can carry out metabolism, it can use that for energy, it can grow, and so on and so forth. But what's most important for us is that the biomass that is created by the plant goes into the next trophic level, so the next layer of animals can consume that plant matter, and we can have our food chains continue. Now, carbon will return to the abiotic world by a couple of different processes. One, through respiration. Okay, so, and when I'm saying respiration, I'm talking about physical respiration of us breathing in, breathing out, and I'm also talking about cellular respiration, when we break down glucose in our cells and we produce the carbon dioxide that's released, and we harness that energy. Most organisms, of course, all organisms will have some form of respiration, but most of them have this aerobic respiration where we burn carbohydrates and we release CO2. So respiration is one way carbon returns to the abiotic environment. The second way we can have carbon dioxide returning is through the burning of organic matter. So if we look over on the two pictures here in the bottom, we'll see that we can add carbon dioxide to the atmosphere through industrial uses, through sometimes what we generally call pollution. Even driving your car can release extra organic matter, or extra carbon into the atmosphere. And then you can see fire, of course, over here. We're actually burning organic matter. All of the smoke there is releasing a lot of carbon dioxide, which is heading back into the abiotic world. Now, the most important part of the carbon cycle in terms of the microbial aspect is through decomposition. Okay, so we had respiration and then burning of organic matter. Those are the ways that carbon returned back to the abiotic world. But in terms of where microorganisms play a major role, and they do play a major role in this, is when we have fungi and bacteria breaking down organic matter. So if we look at our apple right here, it's starting to go through a process of decomposition. It starts up here, which is generally fresh, and then after time and after reactions by fungi and microbes, we get into a state of decomposition. Now, as these bacteria are eating and breaking down this apple, it's producing carbon dioxide if the oxygen is present, and that carbon dioxide is going to be released into the atmosphere. So we're going to have carbon return to the abiotic world. And then if this happens anaerobically, then what we're going to have happen, instead of carbon dioxide being released, we're going to have methane being released, CH4. And that again is also carbon being released back into the environment, back into the abiotic world. Now, the next couple of cycles we'll look at will be much more important, or relying much more on microorganisms.